timetable, we should be firstly having an opening word from President Kobli, then Kalevi Kull and Antti Randpere will follow, after which there will be speech by Vilmos Voigt, Eero Taraste and Stislav Vasik. And hopefully will be ending at around 5:30. I would propose to have questions all together after we have had all the talks. Otherwise, we'll probably run into technical difficulties and we'll just run out of time. With the exception asked by Professor Eero Taraste, who will be having another event after his lecture shortly, so he has to run away, and therefore questions for his talk will probably be then taken right after his lecture. So please, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antti. And before I start, I'd like to say thank you to Antti for arranging this opening seminar and gathering together some friends. And we're so glad to see them on this call. Vilmos, brilliant to see you again. So delighted to have you here. Eero, Ziz, fantastic, and thanks, Antti, for your efforts. So this is a IASS celebration of Sebeok 20 years after his death, 101 years since his birth. And, well, Tom Sebeok, what can I say? Where can I start? Well, I guess probably the only way to start and to make it short is to start with myself. I was lucky enough to have already had a job when I first met Tom, but after meeting him, though, I had a career. And I know that this is the same story for so many people, particularly those prominent in our global semiotic network, including people who are on this call, this Zoom call currently. That's because Tom was the consummate networker, supreme publisher of other people, not just himself, and an all-round helper of people's well-being and careers. But I don't want to just stress that, because he sat certainly at the top of a massive network of people, and he put enormous store by that. For him, it was a web of people, even a priesthood reaching 10,000 years into the future, for those of you who know that part of Tom's work. And I think that I do get the sense that he was enormously proud of founding the International Association for Semiotic Studies in 1969 with Emile Benveniste. And so it's this association that now pays tribute to him and keeps him in our mind constantly. Tom didn't seek to pull the strings by being at the head of this network. Although a genius, he was completely self-aware to the extent that he realized he couldn't do all the work that existed in the missions of semiotics and the Global Academy. He knew that other people had to do the work. Moreover, they had to do their work in their own niche and in their own context, with checks and balances, both institutional and personal, that he completely understood. To give a sense of Tom as a person and Tom as a professional, I suppose the only example I can really think of is, a very personal one to do with football. Footballers who worked with the greatest football manager of all time, an individual from Scotland called Bill Shankly, said that he could take a player of limited talents and make them believe that they were world beaters. And that's exactly my experience with Tom Sebeok, and the experience I know of so many others. I'll give you an example. When I was first in touch with Tom, emailing from an obscure outpost of the densely populated UK university system, his immediate response was, I wondered when we would be in touch. He seemed to know not just individual academics, but he knew who the PhD students were and the topics upon which the PhD students were working. As Jesper Hoffmeyer said in his obituary for Tom, you could email him at any time of the day from any time zone and expect an answer within minutes.
I haven't got a microphone then, is that it?
Ross Aldanese, another from our community, a very early riser himself, was at Bloomington and arranged a meeting with Tom. The meeting took place at 5 a.m., already well into CBOC's working day. But let us not simply remember Tom, the phenomenal worker and inspiring human. That would be all too easy, particularly for those who met Tom. I was aware of the CBOC legend before I ever encountered him, and was principally motivated to make his acquaintance because of the immensity of his research and the awe-inspiring nature of his project. If you think of the massive work that he did in the post-war period in linguistics, today, as we'll celebrate to a certain extent in Finno-Ugric studies, then the absolutely defining work that he did in ethology, animal communication, his own coinage of the term zoosemiotics. Perhaps for many, Tom represents post-war communication theory, and people will refer to that particular period, that particular milieu and that time frame in respect of figures like Bateson, Mead, McCulloch, von Förster, Levi-Strauss, Jacobson, and so on. But between all of them, and perhaps, as John Dealey would say, supervening on this work was CBOC himself. And later, just to give a sense of one area of his achievements and one area of his own intellectual project and work, we have the ongoing project of biosemiotics, which is carried out by the International Society for Biosemiotic Studies. So this is a flavor of why we commemorate Tom. If you're a professional, not just in this field, but if you're an academic, you probably feel like I do. And I can only sum it up by saying that every day I think about Tom CBOC and every day I miss him. So in some ways, this meeting that we have today, I hope will act as a palliative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. And now, according to the timetable, we shall move on to hear what Kalevi, Kull, and Antti Randver will have to say. Kalevi has some pictures as well. I hope you can see them on the shared screen. According to some of your faces, you can, obviously.
So, dear friends in semiotics, here is Tom CBOC and his cat at home in Bloomington 22 years ago. Thomas CBOC built the global semiotics while living and working most of his life, close to 60 years, in one town, in one university of Bloomington, Indiana. So it is. Science may be globally connected and intercultural, but it is always made locally in particular cultures.
Oh, noorega.
Mis nüüd juhtus?
Ma ei tea.
So, rong. Assa kurat.
On järgmist küsida.
Just a moment. since the other computer shows wrong, I'll immediately do a change. It will take a couple of seconds, but the main computer shows the pictures wrong way. Just please go back. What do we have? Time. Näitan arvutist. Võta sealt maha. Üldse share-imine. Sheet. Yes. The Estonian connection started for Sebeok already before he became a semiotician. Sebeok, as a linguist, head of the Department of Uralic and Altaic Studies in Bloomington, Indiana University, had among his colleagues two Estonian professors, linguists Felix Oinas and Alo Raun. And interestingly, say Tom's own bibliography, what is published in a series Arcadia Bibliographica Virorum Eruditorum, includes also bibliographies of those two Estonian professors. Tom had several things that connected him with Tartu. Indeed, one of them was linguistics. He corresponded with our professor of Finno-Ugric studies, Paul Ariste. And of course, semiotics, Jüri Lotman and his group. When establishing the journal Semiotica, he had Jüri Lotman in the editorial board. With Lotman, he shared a theoretical interest on semiotics as modeling, on semiotic systems as modeling systems. And also, of course, Jakob von Uexküll and our interest in biosemiotics. Here is Sebeok with Jüri Lotman in Norway in 1986. Sebeok first visited Estonia in 1970, making a short trip to Tartu. And during 1990s, Tom Sebeok made 3 more visits to Tartu semioticians. His visits certainly influenced the work in the places that he visited. He could, interestingly enough, he could put his reputation to do work so that the local self-confidence into our own work grew as a result of him to be with us. So it happened in Helsinki, in Copenhagen, in Bari, in Sofia, in Tartu, and several other places. Moreover, he could connect these places. My own first meeting with Tom was in June 1992 in South Germany, close to Freiburg in Wlottertal, where Ture von Uexküll arranged a small meeting on Jakob von Uexküll and Humbert Lehre. Tom and her wife, Jean, edited this very first volume under the title Biosemiotics, that very year, 1992. That meeting was in which the contemporary biosemiotics began. Well, of course, we did it already before, in various places. It existed before, but that was where Sebeok, Hofmeyr, Remek, and few others of us first met, and biosemiotics turned into a collective. And so we learned and largely accepted his view to semiotics. That semiotics is many things. It's both in science and the method and the doctrine. That semiotics is a study of modeling systems. That life is semiosis. That there are more than 3 types of science. He's like to speak about 6. Language is exclusively human and begins with syntax. That Umwelt is a model. That endosemiosis occurs in organisms with multiple codes, and that global collective web includes all organisms. So let's have a brief look to his home. I spent there a week in 1999, working every day together with him in his home office, 1104 South Covenanter Drive in Bloomington, house built by his own design. Here's the entrance, together with Jean, his wife, and co-editor of many, many volumes, and his office, where all the volumes of Semiotica and the book series Approaches to Semiotics and others were edited. And of course, books, and many more books. There in Tom Sebeok's home office, and now in Tartu, where they are kept as the Sebeok Memorial Library of our Department of Semiotics. Close to 5,000 volumes altogether. And among these, his own works, for instance, 127 volumes of the book series Approaches to Semiotics he edited. And many rare editions, and those with inscriptions from colleagues, like to the father of Semiotica, from Martin Krampen, several books from Claude Lévi-Strauss, from Umberto Eco. That volume was first published by Indiana University Press. And even from Charles Morris. Sebeok was a student in Charles Morris's small seminar on semiotics in the University of Chicago. And also what was sent to him from Tartu, Yuri Lotman, Vyacheslav Ivanov, Vladimir Toporov, Alexander Pyatigorski, the central group of Tartu Moscow School signed their contribution to semiotics. So, and here, Tom Sebeok's small garden behind his house in Bloomington, this time of the year, and his grave in that garden, grave, for which exact position John Deely has asked to measure. As Murdine Anderson once said, every contact that Sebeok had with a person or idea turned into semiotics. It's really amazing how his energy, his elan is living and beyond, far beyond his life. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalevi, for these wonderful pictures and memories of Tom. Perhaps I, as a person, not having had such extensive possibilities to work with Tom Sebeok, should pay attention to a little bit more principal aspects of Tom's work that were already mentioned also by Kalevi, by his bringing the example of Tom's writing The Estonian Connection, which is one of the many of the connections articles Tom has written about his relationships with other countries, schools, modes of thinking, and so on, which I think is characteristic and interesting in contemporary scholarly situation, beginning from his always important idea of explaining dynamism between certain object levels, walks of life, the so-called domains of study, and fields of practical arrangement of, for example, semiotic or cultural research. It is characteristic also that soon after the first line in his this very Estonian Connection article, he also already starts dealing with issues concerning the global mapping of the semiotic domain, and describing how the actual field work is being executed by field workers, practically then cultivating the domain of semiotics. This seems to be important in the sense that whilst for some time perhaps the domain of semiotics had been quite self-sufficient or self-sustaining, practically understandable concept in the sense what is the object area of semiotics, then it was not only the dependence of the domain of semiotics on practical field work that was outlined by Sebeok, but it was also the very domain itself that started to extend during Tom's time of research, and started to alternate, started to turn into way more complex area of study than, for example, the semiotic study of language or other human science systems. Obviously, in this sense, Some noise is coming from somewhere, but we cannot detect where's the source. Like always, the problem with the noise is. Anyhow, the point I wanted to make was that it was probably Tom's movement in the area of zoosemiotics and biosemiotics that extended the domain of semiotics in general and started to move semiotics to its proper central position it has obtained by now in the area of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary studies that usually have been connected with the era of 1990s, even early 1990s. But nevertheless, it seems that Sibelius realized the necessity of transdisciplinary studies way before they were introduced to modern history of scholarship. Probably it was connected even already with the times of his lengthy discussions with Charles Percy Snow, who, as we know, besides other things, published also the book The Two Cultures, or Two Cultures, referring to kind of seemingly separating wall between scientists on the one hand and intellectuals on the other hand. Why Snow called those two cultures, but not two sciences, of course, is a special point of interest. Anyhow, this bridging of the hard and the soft sciences, or the humanities and hard sciences, has been probably a merit we owe to Thomas Sibelius, not only in the framework of semiotics itself, as we can today speak of symbiotic relationships between, for example, cultural semiotics and biosemiotics, even in the form of very concrete studies called ecosemiotics. We can probably speak about such like transdisciplinary studies also under the title of cognitive semiotics today, where the social, cultural, and biosemiotic issues have been joined together. So I think this aspect of Tom being a leader, so to speak, planetary leader of transdisciplinary studies, is something that has been taken by default and not much quite vivisected in our transcription of the history of semiotics. This is this transdisciplinary topic concerning the fusion of the domain of semiotics and the practical work done by semiotic field workers. This is probably very much in connection with another issue that was sort of indicated by Paul Cobley as well already when he referred to Tom's treatment of, so to speak, longitudinal communication, in the course of which the objective and subjective realities fuse together, and it's difficult to actually pinpoint the research area of semiotics in the sense as I can bring you a definition by Sibiok himself of semiotics in a talk I had with him some years ago at the end of 1990s, where he said quite informally, next to his several formal definitions of semiotics, of course, that quote, "I find it better not to give a formal definition at all, but rather to explain that for me, semiotics is really the study of the relationship between the mind and reality. On the other hand, there is the mind, whatever you mean by mind, the brain or whatever. In this mind, there is a model of reality or of the universe or the cosmos or of whatever is thought of being out there. Jakob von Uexküll called these the Innenwelt and the Umwelt. The Innenwelt is somehow an internal representation of what he called the Umwelt, which I understand only by definition. But let me briefly say that it is the relationship between the internal and the outer world, and I think semiotics studies the relation of reality to illusion, the relation of reality to its modeling, end of quote, which in fact was probably a pretty fine view on semiotics as a way of thinking, as a mode of theorizing back in at the end of the 1990s. But obviously today, when we are speaking about the transdisciplinary fusion of not only disciplines, but the domains of study as well, there is rising more and more harshly and sharply the question where from to search for that mind and that reality out there, which should be then taskfully to be compared by semioticians. In this sense, it seems that biosemiotics, cultural semiotics, and social semiotics have reached a point of their necessary new transdisciplinary redefinition in the sense of how to define their research objects in the areas, in the era, during the times when the ontologically objective realities are being hijacked, not only by simply subjective universes of the mind, but by the subjective epistemical universes that are built in the virtual realities, where clues to the actual referential reality are being lost. In this sense, probably there is a new need to raise again the question or the objective objection described especially by John Deely when he was referring to the pars pro toto fallacy that is concerning the transfer of traditional Semitic descriptive techniques to, for example, the zoosemitic or biosemitic spheres. It seems that Deely was right, that this pars pro toto fallacy started to be turned over from the perspective of biosemiotics back to science systems usually associated with cultural semiotics. Obviously, today the problem of how to find the mind and reality as a kind of reality checkpoint, this redefinition of biosemiotic and cultural semiotic studies should be taken up again. I think that these were the 2 points I basically wanted to mention in the sense of the transdisciplinary developments initiated by Tom already decades ago, and in connection with the fusion of different kinds of realities in the practical semiotic research today, during the era where referential realities are slipping away, not only for cultural semiotics, but also for biosemiotics itself. It seems that if we are talking about genetically modified organisms, for example, we are today we should pay attention also to the category of the agent in the species of Homo sapiens as a potentially genetically modified organism. So in this sense, the agency is slipping away not only for cultural semiotics, but biosemiotics as well. And in this sense, a kind of new transdisciplinary collaboration seems to be needed, be it labeled as cognitive semiotics or general semiotics or however else way. Thank you. And now we should be already having Professor Vilmos Voigt with his talk about Thomas Sebeok as the Hungarian. So Vilmos, if you can manage the technicalities, then please, the floor is yours.
Yes. Good afternoon, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There is no doubt about Tom Sebeok deserves any anniversary memories and further thinking. And I am especially grateful for the organizers who took up this important person, important life work once again. Fortunately, this enormous activity, scholarly publications by Tom Sebeok are still available, more than 1,000 own publications, several hundreds of books and conferences he initiated for making international connection in the true sense of the term. And I thank you very much for the organizers of this meeting, including my Hungarian friends around me. It is very fortunate that if you want to know more about Tom Sebeok, there are excellent introductions, excellent summaries of that. First of all, the famous book, The Semiotic Continues to Astonish, where more than 50 papers, different aspects of Sebeok are mentioned, and also a bibliography, photos, personal remembering, and so. International encyclopedia usually refer to him, and to my great surprise, the data there told about him and his work is more or less correct. Now I want to speak some remarks about how Sebeok became semiotician and the early years and the starting part of the life of Sebeok, of course, is from Hungary. It's a well-known fact, so I I have only to say very briefly about the topic. He was born in Budapest in 1920 in a not so rich businessman family, visited the famous Budapest Lutheran Secondary School, among other alumni of like von Neumann, Edward Teller, Géza Róheim, and more and more. And Tom practically left soon Hungary, and after a very short step over in Cambridge, England, went to United States, where practically finished his university studies in Chicago, having very good contacts with New York, and practically the dissertations and the scholarly work were made by him in Princeton. In Hungary, the extremely talented and absorbing various fields of research, Tom was interested by languages, Italian language, by the way, to make a surprise to Ponzio and Umberto Eco. Then he always wanted to be a zoologist. Very often he expressed his wish to belong to that group of scholars, but practically he moved over language. When in the Second World War time, he lived already in the United States and met there people who offered a very wide horizon to research studies. During and after the Second World War, he used, first of all, languages. His first topic studying languages was by Austronese language, and not very many people remember that the other topic was the Winnebago Indian studies, whom he visited until the end of his life. He started to work on Finno-Ugric studies, and during the war and after the war, it was used by United States government to make a practical Finnish and practical Hungarian language studies. And then he moved to a special topic in Finno-Ugric studies, the Cheremis. Practically, he learned first this topic by the great man of Cheremi studies, Beke. Then, from language and traditional culture, he moved over to structural folklore, and he was the initiator to re-establish, re-evaluate, reformulate the studies of folklore. And his Cheremis studies practically are one of the very first of structural studies, linguistics. From the language, he moved over to a wide area of research as communication studies. And in communication studies, he followed the footsteps of Roman Jakobson, who practically was a doctoral advisor, not officially, but a doctoral advisor of the Tom's University dissertation. In New York, he met persons of the France Libre, the resistant and anti-fascist French intellectual area in New York, like members with Jacques Maritain and others, to whom practically Tom referred as mentioning persons in the European past, mentioning the work of Poinsot. In Bloomington, where he had, as it was said before, for 50 years he was a force-giving person, used general linguistics, speech and speech surrogates, not practical language forms of linguistics, and moved over to speech surrogates, animal communications, and biological factors supported the idea what in his book Prefigurements of Art was expressed, so showing that how animals produce something which is similar or likely similar of arts in human culture. From 1969, it was the origin of International Semiotic Society and International Semiotics as a special kind of research. And Tom was very instrumental in this, referring back to his early connections from the New York Times, connections by Claude Lévi-Strauss, And Tom published the world-famous journal Semiotica practically until the end of his scholarly activity. People who mention Tom's name refer to that topics, and let me mention some so-called, could say, European background of semiotics. This European backgrounds of semiotics made by Tom Sebeok go back to Carl Bühler, and from Bühler, Roman Jakobson, and practically Bühler, Jakobson were the first who used the semiotics as a system of science as one particular independent topic of research. Then he followed the idea of continuing human language as an expression of human culture, where Maritain and Lévi-Strauss are the guiding stars in the way of Tom Sebeok. In Chicago time, he got acquainted with the important Chicago School of General Communication, practically expressed by Charles Morris. And via Morris, Tom went across to a kind of semiotics, which practically goes back to Peirce, and practically Peirce was the arch semiotician to Tom Sebeok. This kind of semiotics, followed later by Umberto Eco, refer to a worldwide classification of science, groups of science, topics of science, and the use of science in a very complicated way, using for semiotics, using philosophy, logic, mathematics, and so many things by Peirce. It is interesting to notice that the two persons who had, in fact, the importance to Tom Sebeok did not include those semiotics and did not include biology, which was added to Sebeok. It is very typical to him that he was always up to date in studying science, or more to say, communication, international new forms of communication, and suddenly he returned to his young boy's wish, that is biology, used by animals and used in the practical, would say, theory of cultural psychology, where Jacob von Uexküll, again a person whose legacy Tom invented and distributed for all over the world, became them. One of the very important feature in Tom Sebeok's life is he loved to connect studies in different fields and persons from all over the world. As a linguist, having a background of expressing communication forms in a matrix of network, that is the language. He used all phenomena of human culture as language, and he used language and the similar topics to language as a kind of semiotics. If we list the most close persons to Tom Sebeok, we find this truly international network from Australia to Japan and supporting Soviet semiotics at that time. So important as no other scholars dared to express. Then let me say some words about the Hungarianness of Sebeok. As I told, he was very young, 16, 17 years old when he left Hungary. His first language was Hungarian forever, faultless language. In Bloomington, he could find some persons who spoke Hungarian, but it is astonishing how well he kept his own mother tongue. Then, after the war, for Iron Curtain time, he was mentioned and continuously was published articles in Hungarian, in Hungary, but his return to Hungary became in the 60s under the sign of semiotics, and I am happy to tell that not only now, decades after his death, but even at that time, we accepted him as an important scholar. He visited several times Hungary, lecturing there, and he got his very first university doctor honoris causa degree from my university in Budapest. He was the foreign member of Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and some people still remember that kind of celebrating the 70th anniversary of Tom Sebeok, starting from Budapest and continuing in Austria, organized by Jeff Bernard and Gloria Mitra. Later, when an innovative institution, the German pattern colloquium, Collegium Budapest, he was a member of that collegium studying work. It was always astonishing how well informed he was. Practically, he watched important channels, being always well-oriented, And also he had a particular feature to find out important, interesting persons working on semiotics or something similar to semiotics. His circle among the persons who in one or other way became connected with the topics Tom himself was used to contribute to, included famous and interesting persons like a retired officer writing first secretly the life of Peirce, or referring to science systems in the antiquity, and using the idea of detecting science, which is his book, You Know My Method, which is about the Conan Doyle method of criminal semiotics. He traveled a lot, and it is sometimes hard to imagine how could he work in so many fields. He used computerized research possibilities always and from the very beginning, and studied the communicative method, the communicative technique together with Jean Humiker, his wife, and giving a background of how culture can be understood as semiotics. In this connection, it is important to remember his Estonian collection, the Estonian biological cultural semiotics was made by excellent scholars, Estonian and not only Estonians, but generally it was Tom who connected this kind of study of science. The star of his Estonian contacts was, of course, Yuri Lotman. There is a long story and an often told story how they met first, how they had their correspondence, and how finally Lotman was able to participate in person in international semiotics from the very beginning. As for the Semiotic Society and the journal Semiotica, Lotman was one of the keystone person in that. Let me finish the short report. I had the opportunity to write several times about him and the questions with his life work, so it is possible to read such publications. And I am very happy that some of the friends who particularly were kind to Tom, and I know that Tom appreciated them very much, are still among us, and we celebrate again our semiotics, that splendid kind of semiotics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vilmos, for your very cordial talk. I can see that we have hands risen by Paul, Robert, and Alina, but in as much as we kind of agreed upon at the beginning that we shall try to leave the questions to the end, then we can just join Paul with his applause, yes? So Professor Eero Tarasti has joined us in the meanwhile, and I know that he has some technical issues that will hamper the fluidity of his talk, because he wanted to show us an excerpt from a video, but now I think we must just keep ourselves to Professor Tarasti's retelling of the video, because I was unable to make it work. So let's now give the floor to Professor Eero Tarasti, and in as much as he has to leave right after his talk, then let's reserve some minutes for questions to him, whereas other questions then could follow after Professor Vasik's talk, after Professor Tarasti's talk. So please, Eero, the floor is yours.
Yes, can you hear me now? Very good, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to this quite wonderful encounter about Tom Sibiok, our great friend, colleague from older times, I would say. And it was really a great idea, and I'm very glad that I'm just speaking here after Vilmos Voigt, because I thank him for my introduction to Tom Sibiok in the year 1979 in connection to the Vienna Great Semiotic Congress of the IASS, the second one, and especially the Congress in Budapest before that meeting which Vilmos arranged then. So then I met first time Thomas Sibiok, and my first impression, if we are allowed here to give the personal memories, is that he was a figure, something between the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph and Sigmund Freud and maybe Ernest Hemingway. So a very impressive person. And then in '79 started our very close cooperation, which continued until his passing away, because we still had the time to celebrate his, I think, 80th birthday in Imatra with the gala dinner, which was shown by the Canadian television and filmed and so. Anyway, so in '79, I learned to know Tom Sibiok, and let me start with the aspect which, of course, was included partly in Vilmos' speech, namely this Finno-Ugrian connection. I would expand it, your category of Hungarian Estonian, into the Finno-Ugrian, so that also the Finland would be with there, because as you know, his career in anthropology and linguistics started as a Finno-Ugrian scholar. And I was told that once a student in Chicago, his teacher said that if you can learn Finno-Ugrian languages, then you can become an anthropologist, because they are so difficult that if you can do this obstacle, then it's all right. And so he started, and you know, in the wartime, he published the spoken Hungarian and the spoken Finnish books for U.S. Army for the case that they would occupy these areas of the Europe. And I had this copy, spoken Finnish, with the video, with the recorded voice by Tom Sibiok and the ambassador of Finland. So method was oral, so that the fictive soldiers Jim and John encountered some Finns, and then they repeated some phrases in Finnish without any grammar, and so they learned language. So it's also a kind of cultural semiotic portrayal of how Finland looked. It is rather humorous to read nowadays. Anyway, then Sibiuk made field work in Siberia. He left for the Volga River. He studied the Mari people and the Cheremis, and his doctoral thesis was on Cheremis culture. That began. He was also in Finland, in Lapland. He studied. He was in Lapland. He knew the Paavo Ravila, the chancellor, who was then later whose daughter was in Bloomington. But his permanent point was certainly Bloomington, Indiana University, in which he was, I think, founding the Uralic Altaic Center of Language Studies. So that was the first thing which the legendary dean of the Indiana University, Herman B. Wells, did. I have here, I once bought in Bloomington this book, you may know this, Herman B. Wells, Being Lucky, his biography, in which he tells the story of the Indiana University, how he did it, namely. He was the main figure during 50 years. I met him in 79. Yes, in 79 in Bloomington. He was still alive then. But he took, and his motto as a rector of a university was, the following I read from the back cover, provide for the esoteric, exotic, and impractical in the curriculum. The practical and pedestrian will take care of itself. The impractical things are the most practical and important in the long run. So he says himself that this Uralic Altaic languages were something very esoteric, and certainly later semiotics, which he favored in the work of Tom Sibiuk. So he was a very important figure. And although we know that Tom Sibiuk was a very traveling person around the world, he remained faithful to his alma mater, Indiana University, until the end of his life. That's the truth. In Bloomington, he arranged symposia 1950s about language, style in language and myth. And to the latter one, Roman Jakobson and Kurt Levi-Strauss attended, and there Kurt Levi-Strauss published his famous study on the Oedipus myth analysis. So, but from mythology, he moved to particularly to this zoosemiotics, the animals. He published his famous prefigurements of the arts, in which he proved that the animals had an aesthetic sense, and he did it with many convincing empirical examples of that. And moreover, from zoosemiotics, he moved to biosemiotics, as we know. And then he joined this Estonian tradition of Jakob von Uexküll, whose biological theories he transferred into semiotic language. Well, quite important thing here was the son of Jakob von Uexküll, Ture von Uexküll, who was, as we know, a famous professor of psychosomatic illnesses in Germany. And by the way, him I also met in Bloomington once he was there, and I was so. So they started this biosemiotics with this Umwelt idea and this Ich-Ton idea of the organism and its surrounding, and the Merken-Wirken, you know, all these wonderful things, and that continued to medical semiotics and to many aspects of natural sciences, even with which. So I would say Tom Sibiuk was certainly an empirical semiotician. So he was interested, he was an empirical scholar, not theoretical one. And he became very active in the organization of semiotics. So we have to thank Tom for all these IASS, for the publishing series at first at Indiana University Press, and then Toronto Press, and then Mutono Greiter in Berlin for this approach to semiotics, which still continues. So it was Tom who just created the platform for other semioticians to bring their ideas. He had his strong opinions about what is semiotics, and also he did not like the French Semiotics at all. I must say, there was absolutely a hostility between him and Greimas and the Paris school. That is, we have to say it openly. And I'm rather glad that I was probably the only person trained in Paris Greimas school whom Tom accepted into his very close friendship. So that I remember that in his office in Bloomington, in the time of fax machines, he had only two direct buttons to two persons, to Umberto Eco and me. So I'm very proud to tell about that. But anyway, so he didn't like this French. And for instance, in the World Congress 79, when there was roundtable on the unification of semiotics, and Julia Kristeva had been there. When Julia Kristeva had to leave the hall, then Tom Sibiok, well, now the major obstacle has left, so now we can start real discussion. But later he said me, oh, Julia, he was a good girl. She was a good girl. She was my assistant in UNESCO, and so it was like that. Anyway, it was in both sides, this Sibiok part and many others, mentioning Greimas also, that French lexicographist. That's what they say. Well, when I went to Paris, visited to Greimas' office, Rue Monsieur le Prince, Greimas told me, oh, the Americans, they have not made much progress. They still study only chimpanzee. So it was both sides of this kind of adversary issue. Anyway, the IASS was very important for Tom, and also the American Society of Semiotics, in which he was at the beginning very central. He left it later for other persons, but he was first. And then personally, I attended the meetings in Bloomington, in Lubbock, Texas, in Buffalo, and in San Francisco, the society. And for me, it gave the model how to arrange the meetings of the Finnish Semiotics Society. So it was very important education for me in that sense. But in the IASS, he was very important until the end. Of course, having also founded the Semiotica, the magazine, which is still very strong, which was then taken by Marcel Danesia, now by Stefania Matthew-Walsh. So we are very glad and we are grateful to Tom for this tradition. But then came later 80s, and Tom got the idea that we should establish a worldwide institute, global institute, to provide the information about teaching and training in semiotics, so that all the possible courses in the world should be gathered in one place, the database. And then he got to the idea of the ISI, International Semiotics Institute. And then Paul Boussac, who was also very active with his Toronto circle, joined, and then a collegium of 40 semioticians decided to found the ISI, and they came to Finland in 1980. Wait a minute, 86 or 88. Anyway, we had already started Imatra, the Congress of Semiotics of our society. So they came to Imatra and they founded this ISI, and then I was elected as the first president. And so Tom's idea was first that the whole globe or world was, rather American way, was put in the so-called regional centers and districts, so that every regional center was responsible for his area, let's say Europe, Australia, Canada, Brazil, Russia, and they should provide the information to Imatra. Now, in fact, this never functioned, because these centers, they just simply did not provide the information enough. Some did, but not all. And then we decided in Imatra, well, let us start ourselves to do that and become a center of education in semiotics. And so started the ISI in Imatra, and it was 30 years extremely active, funded by the European Union twice, and the reason to establish in Finland the Network University of Semiotics, to have a temporary chair of semiotics also, and so. And Tom Sibiok he was always with. He came every year to Finland and gave speeches and supported us in many ways, also by inviting younger scholars to Bloomington. Not only Finns one, but I know he was very important for, well, certain Estonians, Polish scholars, Bulgarians, and many others, so that he had a very decisive role in that sense in semiotics. Well, so it continued, and Tom, how would I say, was making much rather unselfish work in that sense. And let me tell something about his character, because that is also not so unimportant in semiotics. Yeah. I think you have all read the Charles Sanders Peirce's essay on the great men. It's rather nice. Peirce made a list of the qualities of great men in the world. So did they work hard? Did they keep healthy? And so and then I once applied that Peirce's list to Tom Sibiok and his life, and because it seemed to be a very good idea. Anyway, he had as a character, he was very strong. He was a good imperator. He wanted to dominate definitely and give orders to others how to do. And if you did not follow exactly what he wanted, then he showed it. But he also had I would say, a Finno-Ugrian or Finnish sense of humor. Very well. He spoke Hungarian, of course, but he spoke also Finnish, although he did not show it in Finland. But so we couldn't talk here Finnish without Tom knowing what we said. But he mastered it after his early years in among the Cheremish people, and he understood such humorous things like Hotel Klaus Kurki could be Kulaus Kurki, and one radio show was lady called Synnövi Pullo. So these are extremely comical for in Finnish language, but understood only by those who mastered our language. So he had that sense, and he often laughed when the others made some mistakes. Let's say once we had a congress in Imatra, and then one American younger scholar was waited for dinner, but he never showed. And then he called by telephone. Tom had to answer, but this scholar said, "I'm now in Mikkeli." But Tom said, "Why are you in Mikkeli?" He had forgotten to change the train in Kouvola. But then this scholar American said, "I think the map was wrong." So that's another story. Was once we had a meeting in Monterrey, because in Mexico he wanted to establish another new center in Monterrey with Mexican semioticians, and they had some money in the Estado de Nuevo León, and so many Europeans were invited, and also Irmgard Rauch from California. Remember Professor Rauch from German philology, she did one of the World Congresses in Berkeley once. Okay, we waited Irmgard Rauch, but she never showed up. And then she called from a town called Toombs, somewhere between California and Mexico, a very deserted place in which she had maybe taken her own car because she was scared of flying. So Tom said, "Why you are there in Toombs, in such a place?" "Well, because her car broke down." So and Tom laughed very much about that. So we have many personal memories about some, and I would really have liked to show this short video interview of Thomas Sibiok done in Imatra in 1990 Congress, in which he was talking and telling what is semiotics to his mind. And now I remember one slogan which I think many of you have heard, namely, he said that rather cryptic, or should I say mystic phrase, that semiotics studies the relation between illusion and reality. Relation between illusion and reality. What does this mean? I still do not quite understand what he had in mind, but he was actively promoting also the Tartu semiotics. I remember I left with Tom to Tartu, and we visited the tomb of a graveyard of Jüri Lotman, and he had his ideas of what are primary modeling systems and secondary modeling systems, which he insisted. And one of Tom's ideas was that language was not made for communication at all. Language was, mankind invented language because of modeling, make some models of the reality, which would help their survival and living in the world. So that was one of his key ideas. Now, there are excellent studies about Tom's life, and one is, of course, this one. I think Paul Cobley already showed this, namely this anthology, Semiotics, continues to astonish Thomas Sibiok and the Doctrine of Science. So there are many essays on Tom's life and Tom in general, so that you may read also this book. But of course, his output was very prolific, very broad, and it has many exciting. I just gathered from my own library some, but I think Vilmos Voigt also made reference already, and probably Paul Cobley at the beginning. So I think this was all what I had to say in this symposium. So I just thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tarasti. It was a very nice touch of you to show the book by Wells, who was a very important person for Thomas Sibiok, and the concept being lucky was very important for Thomas Sibiok as well, because when you asked about some important happenings in his life, then it appeared eventually that all he had to do was to be able to be lucky and stand by for life to offer its benefits. So I guess we do have some time now. If anyone would like to append something to Professor Tarasti's talk and memories, or maybe there are some questions to Professor Tarasti.
Well, if I complete still myself, can you hear me? Tom was also very important to found other centers of semiotics, and I forgot, it's in Italy, in Bari. He was in Bari University, was very active. We had the Susan Petrilli and Augusto Ponzio Center of Semiotics, which was so actively promoting semiotics in many ways and with many publications. And so I was very glad that Tom once introduced me to these eminent scholars, Susan and Augusto. So that's has to be mentioned about Tom. And then the other one, other issue is in Bulgaria. Of course, he was active in the New Bulgaria University, where Maria Popova was then the director of the, what was that called, the Southeastern Semiotics
European Center.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, center which started. Oh, there is Christian. Hi. Okay, which was very actively doing many congresses with Maria Popova, who started already these famous early fall schools of semiotics at the Black Sea. I remember having attended many times. In the first, it was in that town at the seaside, and then in a monastery in the
Sozopol.
Yeah, so Sozopol, of course, but before that was in Varna. Yes, in Varna.
In Varna, yes.
Varna. Then in a monastery. What was that? Monastery inside your country.
Saint Kirik.
Yes, Saint Kirik, exactly. And then, of course, Sozopol, which became very important. Every year we could return there, and there were a lot of young semioticians especially from Italy, I would say, and Italy and Bulgaria, and also from Finland, Estonia, and many countries. And then Christian Bankov, the follower of Maria Popova, has continued with success this absolutely great tradition, which I hope will continue forever, because Sozopol is an ideal place for such conventions. But I see Tom's figure somehow behind, so he could just put these fires of semiotics everywhere in the world where he came. So he had a great merit in that sense. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Petri, perhaps you want to add something?
Oh, yeah, well, first of all, hello to everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I was just thinking, it really is a big family that CBIOC has managed to construct, also in the extended sense of the family. I must say that one of his biggest merits was the capacity to weave the semiotic web. And create semiotic discourse worldwide, in spite of the fact that semiotics is not necessarily a popular subject in academia worldwide. As an academic subject, it became a widespread course or subject in Italy, and maybe in other European countries, I'm not sure, like France and Germany, I'm not sure, but certainly not in countries, English-speaking countries. It's possible to study semiotics, tell me if I'm wrong, as a cognate course mainly in countries like the US or in Australia, in Canada, even in England. And so in spite of that limitation, let's say, I think he is the motor behind the spread of semiotics as a discipline and also as a culture, characterized basically by dialogue and encounter among different worlds, certainly showing that there is no separation, interruption between nature and culture, showing how dialogue is the main thread, I would say, through signs across different disciplines, across the different aspects of life, and across the world. So it's really good. I think his message and impact has indeed been very strong and promises, I hope, much more for the future, especially with this amplification thanks to technology and communication through thanks to technology.
Thank you very much. Any advancing thoughts from here or comments?
Good to see you, Eero and Vilmos, after such a long time.
Yes, good.
Yeah. It would be good to, I was just thinking, there must be registrations of Tom's talks all over the world. It would be interesting if we could make some sort of a collection and get them together. Have some sort of library, especially now, you know, with thinking about communication and technology with YouTube. Perhaps these registrations could be made available to the larger public. I'm just wondering, you know, I'm not sure that these materials exist, but maybe they do. I think I might have some registrations, a few lessons that I have to see if I can find on tape, though. So I'm not sure that they're still workable.
Okay, let's then leave some time for further thinking and give the floor to Professor Vasik, who will then have also half an hour for his talk about Tom Sibiok's way to the vanguard, from designer to paradigm creator. And after this presentation, we could then have a little bit more extensive comments. I wish Professor Tarasti a nice further event. So, Professor Vasik, yes, please.
Yes, I'm not sure whether you see my presentation because I shared it, but I don't see it on Zoom.
Yes, we do see it, but it's not on the slideshow mode, but we can see it. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And now, do you see?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So then, of course, this is an invitation to Sibiok's Millennium. I'm glad this is the correspondence from Paul Cobley, yes, in the beginning and the row of meetings. And today I wanted to speak about Tom Sibiok's way to avant-garde, from project designer to paradigm creator. And this is my time. I'm very happy to give my presentation after Professor Eero Tarasti, because I happen to be the guest of the International Research Center for Language and Semiotic Studies in Bloomington 1 year after Professor Tarasti, and then I remember here taking part in the summer school 83. I will start with Sibiok as instructor of Finnish and Hungarian, because it is very close to the topic of this meeting today. That means I have done several studies, and for this particular presentation, I have chosen one that is exactly starting from the 1943 to 1980, and yes, and as I announced to everyone in the chat, I published an article in the Chinese Semiotic Studies Now, 17, number 4, from science of language, of culture, to semiosis of life, appreciating Tom Sibiok's role in building of global semiotics. And I have prepared also a book which should be published in the next year, maybe, Science of Language and Science of Life and the Worlds Beyond Science, Technological Paradigms and Terms in Semiotics. Now I start the presentation. The linguistic and special language training career of Thomas Sibiok starts with the history of Central Eurasian studies at Indiana University, which traces its start in 1943. Yes, do you hear me? Here. Hello? Yes, any problem? No voice? No presentation? No. Hello?
Everything is okay. We can see you, we can hear you.
I can read the presentation now, yes? Yes?
Yes, and we can hear you as well.
So we can say that the traces of Sibiok's activity are in 1943, when the administration of Indiana University with President Herman G. Wells made a conscious effort to attract military programs to Bloomington. However, the largest military program at Indiana University during World War II was the Army Specialist Training Program, which brought in several thousand Army trainees for college level training. The single greatest contribution to the establishment of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University was Thomas Sibiok, who arrived at Indiana University in 19 as part of the specialized training program. Originally employed to Indiana University as a linguist with responsibility for training in Hungarian and Finnish, he was soon largely responsible for the running of the East European portion of the program. However, the program ended in 1944, and Sibiok was to assume the first of many various titles. For a short period in 1944, Sibiok was employed by Indiana University support by a grant from the American Council of Land Societies. And then a new Army language training program was begun that lasted through the end of the war and for which he was responsible. Born in Budapest, Hungary in 1920, Sibiok left Hungary in 1936 to study at Cambridge University, but in 1937 immigrated to the United States, where he continued his studies at the University of Chicago. The situation in Hungary, you must have known during that time, he could not return there, yes. Having earned a bachelor's degree at the University of Chicago in 1941, Sibiok transferred to Princeton University, where he received an MA in 1943 and a PhD in 1945. He also had an informal mentoring relationship with the linguist Roman Jakobson at Columbia University, who put him in contact with John Lotz, at that time director of the Hungarian Institute, 1936 and 1957 at the University of Stockholm. John Lotz went on to become the head of the first department of Uralic and Altaic languages at Columbia University, which was established in 1953. According to Blogging Husier History at Indiana University Archives, Thomas Sibiok enjoyed a long and distinguished career at Indiana University from 1943 to 1991. Sibiok started as instructor and linguist for the Army Specialized Training Program at Indiana University under the guidance of Charles F. Ferglin, who provided intensive language training in Hungarian and Finnish for US soldiers. After World War II ended, Sibiok stayed at Indiana University as faculty, specializing in anthropology, folklore, and linguistics. Lacking a proper place for him at Indiana University after the war, Sibiok is made a professor in the English department, where he remains until 1954. Sibiok continued his research on Finno-Ugric linguistics with a trip to Sweden and Finland in 1947, developing his ties with scholars there that he then leveraged into a series of visits to Indiana University through a 5-year grant from the Rockefeller Foundation for the study of Hungarian and Finnish. So this is Sibiok's dissertation, yes, which was published in, as you see, Instytuty Hungaris Universitatis Holmiensis, yes, in January, yes, the first 1946. Of course, Sibiok writes in his memories that he could not do a correction because it was lost somewhere during the war in a ship. Yes, he prepared 2 books. One was Spoken Hungarian, 1945. Yes, and of course, this is a description in which I do not need to read. And then he prepared, after his trip in Finland, Spoken Finnish, the publication date was 1947, then republished in 1949. It is available in microform, yes. This course in spoken Finnish is intended for the use of introductory conversational classes. Oh, this is the description. Each unit contains sections, including basic sentences, word study and review, basic sentences, conversation exercise. And now a short intervention into the presentation of the book. It was during the meeting in Imatra, the presentation of books written by Tom Sibiok, and spoken Finnish was on the table. We always came with my wife Elżbieta and our son Adam to Imatra, and my son Adam took the book and started to read it, yes, and then he noticed, oh, there is no Friday in the book, yes, Monday, Tuesday, etc. So then Friday was mentioned in the book. Yes. In 1952, Sibiok begins the Cheremis project, a long-term study of the language and culture of the Cheremis, Mari people in Central Russia. Much of this study is built on information from the language informant Ivan Yersky, a deserter from the Red Army who arrives in Bloomington after stops in a German prisoner of war camp and post-World War II displaced persons camps. Over the course of the project, funding is received from Indiana University, the Department of State, the Department of the Air Force, the US Office of Education, and also the Arctic Desert Tropic Information Center of Research Studies Institute located at Marsburg Air Force Base, the National Science Foundations, the American Philosophical Society, the American Council of Lab Society, the Social Science Research Council, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Werner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research, and the Newberry Library. I had printed it in order to show you how successful was Tom Sibiok to get grants for his projects. And you see now the first edition of Cheremis Literary Region. It was yes, first published in 1978, yes, and in Louvain, and then it was republished in 1997, yes. Uralic and Altaic Studies. In 1954, Sibiok went to Dean Cleland of the graduate school and said that the Ford Foundation was putting together a nationwide committee to advise on the field of Uralic and Altaic studies. And as a result, Dean Cleveland suggests that we approve a program before the meeting of this committee and suggests to him that he prepare several possible alternative programs, of course, work and research, which he would be interested in undertaking, so that he will have something definitive in the way of suggestion to present to the committee when it meets. This was a memo from the Dean Ralph Cleveland in graduate school to Dean Briscoe on May the 19th, 1994, yes, documents. And Dean Leaf then goes on to say that Tom Sibiok is one of our most valuable men. Much of the reputation of the university in the area of linguistics and almost all of its reputation is Finno-Ugric studies is based on his presence, our future standing in this field. And any opportunities which we have to participate in Uralic Altaic programs and in financial support of such programs will depend on his presence. We must not risk losing him. This was the memo from the Dean Cleland to Dean Briscoe, dated June the 3rd, 1954, where he argues that Sibiok should be appointed assistant professor of linguistics rather than his then current appointment of assistant professors of English. Dean Cleland's assessment of Sibiok was not lost on the university's administration. Within a year, a committee on Uralic and Asian studies was formed with 9 members, and the following year, a separate committee on Uralic studies was established, consisting of 3 members. In 1955, Sibiok was appointed the director of the Air Force Language Training Program 14, and in 1958, the Air Force signed a new contract with Indiana University to allow several hundred airmen to be trained in Russian each year. Also in 1958, the National Defense Education Act was passed by the Dwight David Eisenhower administration, and with it came an enormous stream of new funding for language and cultural studies. Besides funding an extensive number of student fellowships in language and area studies, the National Defense Education Act funded 14 language and area centers, including 1 at Columbia University in Uralic, Altaic, but none at Indiana. However, Uralic Altaic studies also received a research grant to develop specialized training materials in some 25 Uralic and Altaic languages, and to conduct basic surveys and pertinent research dealing with the languages, countries, or other areas. This grant was administered by a special committee on which Sibiok represented Indiana University. 4 Indiana faculty members held subcontract from American Council of Law Societies. This was the memo, February 15, from Thomas Sibiok to Herman G. Wells. Now you see how it was the National Defense Education Act of 1958. This was the bulletin, yes, of 1964, number 41, language and area centers, a report on the first 5 years. Although the universities made these changes on their own initiative, they were substantially aided by support from foundations. During the last 5 years, from the federal government, the principal contribution of the latter has been made under the Title 6 of the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which encourages and supports language development in a variety of ways. Section 601A authorizes the United States Commissioner of Education to arrange on a matching fund basis for the establishment and cooperation of language and area centers by means of contracts with institutions of higher education, while Title 6 is generally concerned with language development. Section 608A also authorizes for support for instruction in area studies, including such academic disciplines as history, anthropology, geography, political science, sociology, linguistics, and economics. My earliest acquaintance with the name of Thomas Sibiok was connected with the world's largest editorial series, Current Trends in Linguistics, The Hague, Moten, 1963-1976. At that time, as the head of the Department of General Linguistics at the University in Wrocław, I could afford to buy all 14 volumes. Imagine, yes? They were very expensive, despite the fact that they were enormously expensive for the country behind the so-called Iron Curtain. Why I could afford it? Because, for example, the Institute of the so-called Slavic, meaning exactly Russian studies, could not use the Grand Promesa to buy books from Western country. So I used all those which remained in the faculty. And then it was in our country, one volume, 5 million zloty, yes, at that time, yes. If you can imagine, yes. However, with respect to my interest in writing a second dissertation for achieving the habilitation degree, which is DLiT, yes, in the domain of linguistic semiotics after my return to Poland, the most beneficial appeared the two parts of volume 12 under the title Linguistics and Adjacent Arts and Sciences. Equipped with the knowledge about the interdisciplinary position of linguistics in the study of sign and meaning systems, I had decided to apply for a stipend in the United States of America. And this is the book, Current Trends in Linguistics. Among the direct achievements of my Fulbright scholarship, which I spent in Tibiox Research Center for Language and Semiotic Studies at Bloomington, Indiana, between February and December of 1982 was Semiotyczne Paradygma Językoznawstwa, a semiotic paradigm of linguistics published in 1987. Then the monograph accepted later as a basis for my DLiT degree. Of course, I can say that at that time, being in the Research Center for Language and Semiotic Studies, and there was a summer school, I had the opportunity to meet for the first time John Dilley, yes, and several other friends with whom I was acquainted during my later appearances at Imatra or in Tartu, yes. From my whole stay in the United States, the most significant enterprise being additionally financed by the Fulbright Commission was my participation in the 4th International Summer Institute for Semiotic and Structural Studies. Organized under the auspices of the International Association for Semiotic Studies at Bloomington, Indiana on May the 30th until the June the 24th, which had stipulated the trajectories of my subsequent research at the Indiana University Library oriented towards writing a future DLiT dissertation. And at that time, I can mention that Professor Sibior managed to organize the NATO Advanced Institute in 1983, and it was an opportunity which I cannot follow. And Susan Petrilli, as I read in her articles, was there. The opportunity to take part in the Advanced Institute on Semiotics and International Scholarship towards a language of theory organized by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Estoril, Portugal, on September the 18th and 13th, 1983 was very appealing to me at that time. However, I was not able to go there together with Tom Sibior due to the visa requirement. Yes, I had a passport, but I could not receive a visa, yes, because it was impossible to fulfill this possibility as a citizen of Poland, a country belonging at that time to another political military alliance, namely the so-called Warsaw Treaty Organization, known as the Warsaw Pact. And also I was soldier and officer in that pact too, yes. You know, and now this is the book which was published, Semiotics and the International Scholarship Towards a Language of the Theory, edited by Jonathan Evans, whom I have known from Bloomington in Indiana, and Andrei Helbo, yes, NATO IC Series, Behavioral and Social Science 923, Proceedings of the NATO Advanced Study Institute, Estoril, Portugal, September 18 to 30, yes. thanks to Sibiok's teachings and the mind-steering course, historiographical foundation of semiotics, chaired at that time by Umberto Eco and John Dilley, which took place at ISIS 83, the research base for the purpose of my future dissertation on the semiotic paradigm of linguistics, semiotyczny paradygmat językostwa, had been extended through the biological concept of meaning as significance introduced to semiotics by Tom Sibiok, following Jacob von Uexküll and elaborated by his son Ture von Uexküll on the international scale. The domain of my research have been enriched by a new vision of linguistic semiotics, the core of which made up 4 areas, including the Imwelt theory and the division of semiotic discipline, the stance of collective solipsism, the notion of the semiotic self, and the hierarchy of modeling systems. These 4 areas have recently opened a new space for my phenomenological epistemology, merging the frameworks of existential and transcendental semiotics with the biological and anthropological conception of subjective significance in the realm of living system. As you see, the work cited and consulted, it is Puckett, Blake, Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University, the pre-department years, Indiana University Linguistics. Then Tom Sibiok, yes, 1997, yes, My Short Happy Life in Finno-Ugric Studies, Hungarian Studies. It is always everyone known, yes. And then Katia Morrison, yes, from Euro-Asian to installation, yes. The Thomas Sibioks and the Scientific Self exhibit. Thomas Sibiok, blogging whose history, Indiana University Archive, posted on January 17, 2019, yes. And my recent article published in Chinese Semiotic Studies is From Science of Language and Culture to Semiosis of Life, appreciated Tom Sibiok's role in the building the global semiotics. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Vasik. And obviously now we have time for questions or comments.
Yes, the problem, I hear you, but I don't see you. Do you see me? Because
Yes, we can see you very well.
Oh, yes, but no problem. I will speak without seeing myself and seeing you. Yeah, I join how to join the meeting. They get started.
Stop share screen.
Because yes. Yes, expose. Aha, stop shares. Aha, stop share. Stop share. Aha, stop share. Yes, I am there. And hello, Tyler James. I see you. Yes. Good. And Hanno is also known to me very well. Yes. And Susan Petrilli, I have seen. Yes, it was a happy opportunity. So then we have won something from the COVID situations, yes, to start with webinars to see each other from remote center. I have seen my friend Merkulova here also from Moscow. Yes, that is the thing to share, yes, because I have seen participants here, yes. Then I have seen many, even from Romania, from Bulgaria, yes, from Tartu, yes, and Finland, yes, good. Yeah, thank you. Good.
So this is one of the advantages, let's say, of the hell that we've been going through. So at least this, thank goodness, it has changed the way we can do conferences and meet, facilitating meetings and encounter.
Yeah, my wife Elżbieta sits in another room also with such a light.
Yes.
She is hectically engaged in her writing.
Yes, yes, of course.
Good.
You know, you reminded me of Estoril. I was just writing to you to ask you to send me those two, what do you call them? The two images where you mention it, because I don't have the details. So I appreciate that. That was the first time I met Tom Sebeok, and he was I went there as a translator. I was committed to translating his book into Italian, The Sign and Its Masters, his book of 1979. And there I also met Massimo Pesaresi, who is another Italian translator of Tom Sebeok. He translated, I think, Insegno dei, I'm not sure actually, I think it was The Play of Amusement, Il Gioco del Fantasticare, his 1984 book. So, yeah.
Yes. I remember, because I read your article, that you phoned to Sebeok, or maybe he phoned to you.
That's
Yes?
right, yes.
Oh, that a lady with a accent, yes, because an Australian accent. Yes.
That's right, yes. I phoned him, he'd arrived in Milan, and I was on the phone to him with Augusto Ponzio. We phoned together, and that's when the whole relationship started. That's when we started translating him into Italian, writing and making contact with the semiotic community. You know, it was, if we're here together as we are today, it's thanks to Tom. This is the continuation of his initiative, of what he initiated. So it's such a pleasure. Yeah.
Susan, Italians are very active in translating very important books. For example, Gregory Bateson was translated also.
Yes. Well, I must say that this is one of the great merits of the Italian academia, if you like. There has been a very intense translative activity here. Lots of books are translated into Italian. And unfortunately, though, I think this is changing because the career system has also changed, in the sense that translations and edited volumes are no longer given the credit they were given in the past, which is a crime. It really is a crime, because it means that the younger people who are involved, rightly so, with their careers and everything, will not translate the way we used to. It's such a shame. I think perhaps, translating is perhaps the most important work we can do for the community, quite frankly, apart from, what we write. Translating and circulating ideas, I think, is certainly absolutely central.
Yes.
Anyway.
I call it punctosa. This is the aberration with points that we see from the minister.
Exactly.
Greece, it is not mentioned in the ministry, I have no points, and the work is incredible.
That's right. It's the tyranny of administration. And in fact, in terms of ministries, they don't talk about books and publications, but products. We produce products. We don't write books or articles anymore. It's the products. And I mean, that tells the story.
Let me say here that I agree that this translation is very important, because I think all the classics of semiotics, they should appear in the small national languages, so the students would just assume their heritage in their own terms, own language. So that is extremely important for all over the world. Let's say be China, Japan, or Farsi or whatsoever. So, and I remember the Estoril very well. I was there. I think we were only two from non-NATO countries, Ivan Itamar Zohar from Israel, and I was from Finland. So it was a very nice meeting. The only thing was that there were more teachers than students. So that I think we were teaching each other very much in that connection. But I have also one question to you, sorry, Wasik, really about semiotics in Poland, in your country. So we know your great competence and expertise in linguistics, and then your orientation towards maybe phenomenology, also like with your Elżbieta, your wife. But what are the schools, main schools now in Polish semiotics? So do you have all varieties, so cultural semiotics, Persian, let's say, or what's the situation?
As you remember, Sibiałok was an organizer of semiotic life, and he did not push himself. He rather invited people. For example, he came to Tartu to start the cooperation with Yuri Lotman, yes? And then Yuri Lotman was in the foreground, yes? He organized also the International Semiotics Institute, yes, in Imatra, and then you were the most important person. And he did the same with Jerzy Pelc, yes? He was in, and then, you know, I took the part in Puławy. It was the Philosopher's Sign. It was organized by Jerzy Pelc. And Jerzy Pelc, in fact, was the president, as you know, for 10 years, yes? But it was Tom Sibiałok who managed it. As John Dilly said, Sibiałok was the eminent grise, yes? Installed into their positions. As I am here with you, Eero, yes, that I can say, I was in La Coruña, yes, you remember La Coruña. It was the famous, and I met there Roland Posner, and he said, yes, that the International Semiotics Institute was initially planned for Berlin, yes, and in fact, yes, it was the idea, because I did not include here the books which were published under the auspices of Tom Sibiałok and other people, and Roland Posner. Roland Posner published the volume Semiotics in 3 or 4, yes, part, yes, which I erased here from my presentation. And then he said that in the evening, he announced him, no, we will install the Toronto, yes, summer school in Imatra, yes. And then you were invited by whom? There was a director of your institute there, and he's, can you remember her name? She is now in Tampere. She was director of she organized every school, summer school in Imatra.
Yes, we had in Imatra all kinds of special schools, like the medical semiotics was always, and then also I must say that this Estonian semiotics got rather much. Like Kalevi Kulbo was there with the students, and so we had a lot of this biosemiotics very strongly. First in Imatra, then it continued more in Denmark and in Estonia, but it was first, thanks to Tom Sibiałok, was just in Imatra. But about this history, I will say that, of course, Roland Posner, he was the great semiotician, really great, my predecessor as the president in the ISS, and he was very, yes.
It was Pentti Rossi.
Ah, yes.
Yes. Rossi, sì.
Rossi.
Well,
and
Well, okay, but that's history already, because you know the ISI does not exist any longer. So that's. But in that phase, when it was at the beginning, we did not steal Toronto, but I think it was the Toronto people just they get tired with their long summer schools. I think 1 full month in Toronto, and then Paul Boussac was thinking that, well, why should not be or Danesi thought that could be transferred to Imatra. And so we could try to continue, and I think we continue this Toronto circle also rather many years in Imatran context. So.
It was Toronto Semiotic School, and then it was only Imatra, yes?
Yes.
Yes, because of Boussac, etc. I remember the story, yes. And then I took part in this first semiotic schools where indeed they were given lectures, 7 days a week, lectures and lectures after lectures. And then it started to be more like the system of meetings, of conferences, yes, that we presented papers. And in the end, we could present workshops. You invited also famous people like Jacques Fontany, yes?
Yes, sure.
Yes, you had grants for inviting very important people there, yes?
Yes, thank you, because we were enjoying twice the European Union funding, rather well through the East, Southern Karelian Institute, because that area of Finland was considered an unfavored region of the Europe. In Helsinki, it would have been totally impossible. Helsinki was quite favored region, but the Karelia was less. And so that's why we could get, and we could invite really many students, so that maybe the most important heritage of Imatra has been this educational, that many young Semiticians who had never given any speech in any congress before came to Imatra, and they could give their speech in a benevolent atmosphere, however meeting the high specialists of their fields. So.
And what has crowned all these Imatra events was, of course, the Congress, yes?
Paul Cobley has been willing to say something for a longer time already, and then Vilmos also wants to add something. Please, Paul.
No,
muted. Completely muted. What a novice. Thanks, Antti. I'm pleased to see you, and I had a question about your quite remarkable paper, and it's this: when we write the narrative of semiotics, institutional semiotics, we tend often to write the narrative of Seebeok and semiotics. And certainly even today, I nearly fell into this trap, which your paper has kind of saved me from. And the trap is that the narrative is Seebeok worked on Finno-Ugric studies and on Uralic Altaic studies throughout the 1950s, then went to Stanford. Okay, and then after Stanford, around about 1963, with the coining of zoosemiotics and with the writing of the review of Lily's book, suddenly we've got a completely new direction. But in truth, if, and this is a kind of lesson for us all, I think, and I wanted to hear your comments on it. In truth, he continued to publish in that sphere of Finno-Ugric studies for years and years afterwards, well over a decade. And in 1979, if you remember, he wrote this essay on John Lodz as one of the neglected figures in semiotic inquiry. So I wondered if you had any observations on that, on the back of your paper.
You are asking me?
No, I was asking Sis, but anyone can answer, because I think it applies to us all.
Professor Vasik, then please. Vilmos probably also can add something. And Kalevi wants to say first something.
No.
Making faces.
In fact, I had to study more because now thinking about John Lodz, you mentioned it is important to continue this line. And of course, it is mentioned that after 1963, Sibiok continued to keep the journal of Euro-Altaic studies, but he began with biosemiotics, and it was a parallel line. Nevertheless, he published also current trend linguistics, which was a huge enterprise. So then linguistics was a parallel line, yes? And for my side, because I was a linguist, when I took a stipend in the United States, I continued the line of linguistics, semiotics. But then, after some years taking part in many conferences, I devoted more attention to biosemiotics, being Tartu, for example, yes, and to the semiotic phenomenology, yes. That is. So then, probably, if we have the opportunities to publish somewhere, yes, we could develop this line. As you have seen in my presentation, it was exactly devoted to Finno-Ugric studies, yes, maybe also to my development there, yes, and I stopped there, yes. But of course, now this is the second and the most important part, the semiotics as a science of life. This was about semiosis also, yes. This is the line, yes. But Sibiok, for example, was never interested to make a hierarchy, to make definitions. He rather gave examples. And for example, he published as early as 1973 his article on the science, but it was the enumeration of science, yes? He gave examples of science, but he did not give any definition in the logical sense. What it means in the logical sense. Genus proximum and differentia specifica. So then, as you read the article of Anderson, yes, in the book of semiotics continues to astonish, or about Tom Sibiok, he was a kind of splitter, yes, that he split it into ideas, yes, developed more attention, yes, to analytical proceedings. So he was rather an analytical philosopher than the logical philosopher, yes. Is it, have I answered your question? Yes.
Vilmos, maybe you would have
Again, yeah, that's an excellent answer. I mean, Vilmos may say a little bit more. I mean, one observation that I wanted to make, something that was going on in my mind, is that I should be at another meeting now, because I've got, you know, lots of things that I have to do in my university, and we're all the same. We're all like that, you know. And we come together for semiotics, and you know, I can just about make a meeting here and do that, but Sibiok could like build a massive edifice while still doing his work at his university in Uralic Altaic studies, or, you know, editing current trends in linguistics and so on and so on. So I very much welcome your paper, because we should talk more about having to split, like Merdin says. Sorry, Vilmos.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We do.
Practically, I have only some very short remarks concerning our conversation about the legacy of Sibiok. Since the beginning of the actual new semiotics, the context has been changed definitely. Today, the linguistics, today the theory of literature, today the philosophy, etc., is completely different from those which was at the end of the 60s, and which made the possibility to establish international flourishing semiotics. My second short remark is that we can reckon with 3 generations of Sebiokian semiotics. The first generation, Tom Sebiok and his fellow scholars, they gone away. So this kind of background, which belongs to the first generation, is not more existing. When we remember the conference, the Congress in Milan, then we know that that Roman Jakobson and persons of his age were dominant one. Now it's over, and there is this generation, this first generation is not existing. Then came a second generation, and it is interesting to mention that this second generation of semiotics were directly or indirectly influenced by Sebiok. If we mention persons like Umberto Eco, Augusto Ponzio, Roland Posner, Jerzy Perc, just to mention persons you have already referred to, this is a second generation who I would think have made so many important achievements that they will not form a different next generation. And now we are coming to an interesting question, to the third generation. If you call third generation of international semioticians, if you follow the year in when and where they met semiotics, that practically I can see that it is our students who form not a coherent group, nor one school, and they are by far not as many functional, not as much internationally as the previous ones were. So to come back to the founding fathers of the modern semiotics, now it is quite a different phenomenon. And listening to our comments, I would say that there will be the time to rewrite the history of international semiotics in the last, let's say, 60 or more years. This handbook, the semiotic, you mentioned also, gave a very, very update picture of semiotics, but semiotics of the first generation and to some extent of the second generation, but the third generation of international semiotics is absent from that. So we have to read this event from a different point of view. And let me mention that semiotics in Japan, and especially semiotics in China, offer absolutely different vistas to studying than the previously mentioned. So the situation of international semiotics is quite different from that 20 or 30 years ago. So.
Thank you, Vilmos. Verdine, you switched on your camera. Does this mean that you have a comment?
Yeah.
You are silenced, Verdine. You have to switch on your mic as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
Four small notes besides saying thank you very much. One is that I believe Tom Sebeok's transdisciplinarity was heavily influenced by the cross-disciplinarity built into US American anthropology, thanks to the German founder, Franz Boas. Second small note is that I think after Shevaroshkin, the Ugrian and Altaic language families are no longer intimately engaged with each other, but they are among 5 language families, including Indo-European, so that unit at Indiana no longer exists under that name. I believe it's Central European, Central Eurasian. The third thing, which is most important, is that I sound like a broken record, but there are tapes of Tom. Anytime John Deely was in Tom's presence, he had, from 1983, when I met the two of them, until the end, John Deely was taping Sebeok. Those are very important tapes. They should be made public, yes. Finally, and this is trivial, I only met Tom in 1983 at that Summer Institute. However, in 1977, when I took my job at Purdue and was asked by a student for a definition in my introductory anthropology class, I said, nothing interesting can be defined. The student persevered. I could only reply, everything is interesting. And I went back to my office and put that note on my door. And it is, even though it's a different door in 2021, that note is still there. Nothing interesting can be defined. Everything is interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vilmos, please.
I just can add one more remark. If you think over the history of the last decades by semiotics, it's quite different. Let us take an example. 30 or 40 years ago, the Soviet semiotics, including already the Tartu Moscow School, or as the Russians used to say, there were the Moscow, the Tartu School. But the Soviet style of semiotics died out. It's no main representatives left the Soviet Union or practically died, to use it so harsh. The only exception, and both the traditional semiotics and the up-to-date semiotics is avid and flourishing, is Tartu. In Tartu, there is a continuation of the tradition. There is a continuation of innovations like biosemiotics in its very interesting different forms, but still excluding or leaving outside of the study some phenomena which both in theory of literature, linguistics are absolutely different from those of 20 years ago. So sometimes we give a retrospective view of semiotics of the last years. The best example for the change, for the differentiation, for the developing and not developing is the case of the Lotmanosphere, the cult of Yuri Lotman, the worldwide importance of Lotman. But if you really read the works of Lotman, it is in one way, and according to my taste, it is semiotics, but some people would say that it is not semiotics at all. It is not monstics, and Tartu should be proud of continuing this tradition, but this tradition is as much and as rich as some cultural paradigms exist elsewhere. We have to think over the past of our semiotics.
Thank you, Vilmos. Now I would like to ask if there are any other comments or questions. Obviously, Vilmos's last comment can be a nice summary for today's meeting. So let me remind you that the next webinar will take place already tomorrow, and you just have to check the EISS webpage, or Tom also sent a note to our chat where you can get information about the time and the login options. So I guess if there remained any further open questions or comments from today, then we are not banned to raise them in the next meetings as well, hopefully. So thank you very much, all the speakers and all the participants, for good comments and questions and nice faces, maskless faces, luckily. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello to everybody. Goodbye to everybody.
Yeah.